14 days had passed since the black sedan left the shoulder of Highway 41 and crossed 3 lanes of oncoming traffic. 16 shortbread cookies sat in a small tin in Dorothy Whitley's canvas bag, baked that morning at 4:30 in her own kitchen, pressed through a small hand-cranked die her grandmother had given her in 1979. The tin was warm against her hip as she stepped through the front door of Brookside Rehabilitation Hospital at 6:58 in the evening, 2 minutes before the final visitor pass of the day would be denied by the lobby desk. She wore her Sunday dress, a deep brown wool with a small white collar, and her best walking shoes, polished the night before. She had been a widow for 9 years. She had been the head housekeeper at the Caldwell estate for 31 years. She had been retired from the estate for 2 years, since the new management made her position redundant on paper. She still carried the keys to the back service entrance of the estate in a small leather pouch at the bottom of her handbag, even though she had been politely asked to return them in a letter signed by the family lawyer. She had not returned them. She was not sure why exactly, except that her late husband Eugene, who taught Sunday school at Second Baptist for 42 years, had once told her that a kind person is the richest person in the room, even when the room is empty. Dorothy walked to the elevator bank on the 2nd floor. She pressed the button for the 4th floor. She carried the small tin the way she had carried a similar tin once a week for 31 years into the kitchen wing of the Caldwell estate, where Richard Caldwell would sit at the breakfast bar and eat 3 of those shortbread cookies with his black coffee before reading the morning paper. That was the man, Dorothy thought. Not the man in the marble lobby. Not the man on the cover of Forbes. The man at the breakfast bar with his coffee and his paper. The man who had always remembered to thank her on her birthday. 16 cookies, 14 days, 1 locked door at the end of a private hospital hallway. Dorothy was 28 years old the first time she walked through the kitchen door of the Caldwell estate on Peachtree Road, the spring of 1989. She had grown up the daughter of a sharecropper in a small Arkansas town where the buses ran twice a day and the church bell rang by hand. She had picked cotton through the long summers and walked 7 miles to the schoolhouse in the cold winters. She had married Eugene at 20, in a small ceremony at Second Baptist, in a borrowed dress her aunt had sewn by hand. Eugene had been a janitor at a downtown office building and a Sunday school teacher at a church that asked nothing of its members, except that they come back. They had moved to Atlanta the year their second daughter was born, looking for a job that paid more than the cannery and a school their daughters could walk to without crossing a 4-lane road. Dorothy had worked as a hotel maid on Peachtree for 2 years before Rebecca Caldwell, the wife of Richard Caldwell the elder, asked the hotel manager to recommend his best linen folder. Rebecca had read the newspapers. Rebecca had noticed the Caldwell name in the business section once or twice a week. Rebecca had called the hotel one morning, and the manager had given her Dorothy's name on the back of a small index card. Dorothy took the train across town on a Tuesday morning in April and walked up the long stone path to a pale brick house with white framing and a copper bell beside the kitchen door. The house smelled of old wood and cut flowers. Rebecca offered her a cup of coffee and a slice of pound cake at the kitchen table, and from that small kitchen table Dorothy would learn slowly what kind of family the Caldwells were. Richard was kind in small ways that did not show on a balance sheet. He remembered her birthday. He asked her about Eugene. He noticed when her sister had been sick and quietly left a small envelope on her desk on a Friday afternoon. He never asked her if she had voted. He never asked her where she went to church. He only asked her on a slow Tuesday afternoon whether the rosemary by the service porch was coming in. That was the man. Eugene passed of a heart attack in the spring of 2015 in their bedroom on a Wednesday morning while she was still on her way home from the early church service. Dorothy folded his clothes the next day. She put his coat on a hanger. She put the Bible he had taught from on the dresser. She went back to the estate on Monday and did not speak of it. Richard poured her a cup of coffee that morning and set it on the counter beside her dusting cloth without a word, and walked back to his study. She had not wept at work in 31 years except once on that morning. She carried the keys to the back service entrance in her handbag that afternoon, and she has carried them there ever since. By the time Richard Caldwell lost his memory in the crash, his family had grown very large and very far from him. He had 3 children by his first wife, none of them close to him. He had 1 daughter by Edith, who died of cancer the year Dorothy's husband Eugene passed. He had 11 grandchildren, of whom he kept a careful mental list, printed every Christmas on a small cream card he kept in his wallet. He had a controlling son, Preston, who ran the family's commercial real estate arm, and who believed the family business was more important than the family name. He had a second wife, Melanie, who had been his physical therapist in his late 50s, and who had married him 8 years before the crash, and who, by the afternoon of the crash, had already begun the slow legal work of moving the family's biggest assets into a quiet trust. She had written herself with the help of a Florida lawyer who specialized in elderly billionaires. Preston called his father every Sunday afternoon at 4, the way his father had called his own father every Sunday afternoon at 4 when he was a boy. The calls lasted 6 minutes. Preston talked about the second quarter. Melanie talked about a new doctor she had found in Miami. Richard listened. At the end of every call, Preston would say, "Father, we are thinking of you," and Richard would say, "Thank you, son," in the same even voice he had used at the breakfast bar for 31 years. Voice was not warm. The voice was not cold. The voice was the voice of a man who had learned to live inside his own quiet house. Dorothy, hearing these calls from the kitchen doorway while she folded a sheet, would walk back to the laundry room and stand very still for a moment and think of Eugene and the way Eugene used to say in his Sunday school class that the loneliest house in the world is the house with the most rooms. She would fold the sheet smaller the second time. She would not speak of it. The crash happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn on Highway 41, 4 miles north of the Caldwell estate. Richard had been driving himself to a routine cardiology check across town. He had been alone. The sedan crossed the shoulder, drifted 3 lanes, and rested against the median guardrail. The emergency team cut the roof. The police found a small cream card in his wallet, a list of 11 grandchildren. The team found a small leather pouch in his glove compartment, an old house key, a key nobody could match to any current lock. The key had a small scrap of paper folded inside it, written by Rebecca Caldwell in 1989, the morning she gave the key to the new housekeeper and told her she was now part of the family. The crash broke his collarbone, broke 4 ribs, broke his left femur, and broke the long, quiet storage of his memory. He woke in the Brookside Trauma Unit 12 days later with no name, no history, no recognition of his wife, his son, his grandchildren, his money, his house. His pupils were clear. His voice was clear. The man inside his skull had been wiped clean as a schoolroom chalkboard on a Sunday afternoon. Preston flew in from a board meeting in Singapore and stood at the foot of the bed for an afternoon. Melanie arrived from Miami the next morning in a cream blouse and a small leather bag. She sat beside the bed for an hour, asked his nurse if he could remember the children's names, was told no, and quietly called her Florida lawyer on the back patio of the hospital. Preston asked his father's nurses if his father had been told he was rich. The nurses said they would not discuss the matter with anyone except the patient or his power of attorney. Preston signed the power of attorney paperwork that afternoon, in a small private room on the 3rd floor, with 2 witnesses and a coffee from the lobby vending machine. The nurses went on about their shift. By the end of the first week, the family had visited 4 times. By the end of the second week, the family had not visited at all. By day 14, Richard Caldwell was alone in his private room with a soft foam collar around his neck. 3 physical therapy sessions a day, his breakfast tray untouched, and no visitor from his legal family. Gatekeeper at Brookside was a nurse named Teresa Banks, a 53-year-old Jamaican-American woman who had been a charge nurse on the rehabilitation floor for 19 years. Teresa had started as a unit aide in 1995 and had worked her way up while raising 2 daughters alone in a small brick apartment in southeast Atlanta. She had been the head nurse of the 2nd floor for 11 years and had been promoted to the rehabilitation floor 3 years before the crash. She knew Dorothy by name from a small hospital charity luncheon the previous year, where Dorothy had made 60 small shortbread cookies for the welcome table and had insisted the young volunteers take the slightly burned ones home in foil. Teresa saw Richard every morning at 6:15 for vitals. She saw the family visiting total of 0 on. The second week, she saw Melanie calling the Florida lawyer every other day. She saw Preston sending a junior associate from his law firm to sign updates and pick up mail. She saw Dorothy arrive at 6:58 on the evening of day 14, in a brown wool dress, with a small tin of cookies. She saw Dorothy walk past the lobby desk without a proper visitor wristband and reach the 4th floor by an elevator she had used before. She saw Dorothy check in at the 4th floor nurse's station, sign the visitor book without complaint, and ask in a quiet voice whether Mr. Caldwell had eaten his noon lunch. The lunch had not been touched. The lunch had not been touched for 6 days. Teresa looked at Dorothy's visitor badge, looked at the paper for the patient, looked at the chart, and asked Dorothy how long she had known this patient. Dorothy told her plainly that she had known Richard Caldwell for 31 years as the head housekeeper of his estate, and that she had been retired from the estate for 2 years, but had kept the small leather pouch of keys, because her late husband used to say a kind person is the richest person in the room. Teresa wrote Dorothy's name at the top of the visitor log and added, in her own careful hand, the words unpaid caregiver, temporary, please advise. She walked Dorothy down the long hallway to the fourth door on the right, and let her knock softly twice and enter alone. Dorothy sat down in the small green vinyl chair beside the hospital bed and placed the small tin of cookies on the side table and opened it slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her to open a wedding gift with both hands and a quiet breath. The smell of warm shortbread drifted across the bed rail and across the pillow and across the closed eyes of the man in the foam collar. Richard opened his eyes. He looked at the tin. He looked at the cookies. He looked at Dorothy. He did not recognize her face. He did not recognize his own sons. He did not recognize the small photograph of Edith his daughter had slid under the pillow the first week. He recognized something else. He reached for a cookie. He held it in his palm for a long moment. He lifted it slowly to his mouth. He bit a small piece from the corner and let it rest on his tongue. He turned his head back to Dorothy, and in a voice that belonged to a small boy in a kitchen much smaller than this one, he asked her if she had made them the way his mother had taught her, with the brown sugar and the small pinch of nutmeg and the long slow bake. Dorothy told him, in the same voice she had used for 31 years at the kitchen counter, that she had made them the way his mother had used to make them on a Sunday afternoon in October, in a small brick house in Macon, in a kitchen that smelled of orange peel and rain. He ate 2 more cookies. He closed his eyes. He did not speak for the rest of the visit. Dorothy sat in the green vinyl chair until the lobby bell rang the close of visit chime. She set the remaining 13 cookies on the side table in a small neat stack. She stood up. She folded the empty tin in her canvas bag. She walked to the elevator. She went home. She did not speak of Mr. Caldwell for the rest of the evening. She read a chapter of the book of Isaiah. She put her Bible on the dresser. She went to bed early. She rose again at 4:30 the next morning and baked 16 more cookies for the next evening's visit. She did this for 10 days in a row without telling anyone except Teresa Banks and her own daughter, Janice, who answered the phone on a Sunday afternoon, and listened to her mother describe the long, quiet hallway of Brookside and asked, very kindly, what it was that the cookies were doing that the doctors could not. Dorothy told her daughter plainly that the cookies were reminding his tongue of his mother. The escalation began on day 24, the afternoon Preston came back from Singapore. Preston had been told, in a single short email from a junior associate at his law firm, that a retired member of the household staff had been entering the rehabilitation floor without a current hospital-approved visitor credential. Preston did not read the email until he had landed. He read the email in the back of a black sedan on the highway from the airport. He called the hospital administrator from the sedan. He called the head of security from the elevator of his downtown office. He called Melanie from the back of a second sedan. He arrived at Brookside at 3:30 in the afternoon in a dark blue suit and a small silver pin in his lapel that he wore only at board meetings. He walked to the 4th nurse's station and asked, in a low and even voice, for the identity of the woman who had been visiting his father's room every evening for 10 days. The unit clerk told him it was a former employee of the family. Preston asked the clerk for the woman's name. The clerk told him. Preston walked to the small private conference room on th. second floor and dialed Dorothy's number from the hospital directory. Dorothy answered the phone on the 3rd ring, in the middle of icing a small peach cake for her daughter's birthday. Preston introduced himself officially and asked her, very politely and very firmly, to provide a written justification for her continued visits to his father's room. He told her that his father's primary care team agreed that visitors without approved credentials could affect the long-term cognitive recovery of the patient. He told her that the family had arranged for a small private sitter to attend to his father's daily needs. He told her, with the same even voice his father had used for 31 years at the breakfast bar, that her years of service to the family were appreciated, and that a small commemorative gift, the gift of a silver pendant with the Caldwell family crest, would be sent to her by private courier within the week. Dorothy set the icing spatula down on the small telephone table beside her refrigerator. She told Preston plainly that she had not come for a gift. She told him she had come for Mr. Richard. She told him she had baked 16 shortbread cookies every evening for 10 days because Mr. Richard was eating none of the food on the breakfast tray, and because, on the first evening she had visited, Mr. Richard had recognized the cookies by the smell and had asked her if she had made them the way his mother had taught him. She told him that the recognition of the smell had been the first voluntary sentence his father had spoken since the crash. She told him finally that she understood he was a very busy man and that she did not want to trouble his evening or his week, but that she would be at Brookside at 6:58 the next evening with 16 more shortbread cookies whether or not the family approved her visit. She hung up the phone. She finished icing the peach cake. She went back to bed at 9:30. She rose again at 4:30. Preston called his lawyer that evening. He called Melanie. He called the family security chief. He told each of them, in the same even voice his father had used at the breakfast bar, that the family's position on the visitor credential matter was that no one outside the immediate family should be granted unsupervised access to his father's room for a minimum of 8 weeks. The lawyer drafted a letter. The security chief sent the letter to Brookside's chief of staff by priority courier on Wednesday. Melanie signed the letter on a Thursday from Miami. Friday morning, the chief of staff at Brookside posted the new visitor access policy on the small bulletin board outside the cafeteria. Teresa Banks read the policy on her lunch break on Friday. She walked down the long hallway to the 4th nurses' station and asked the unit clerk whether Dorothy Whitley was on the approved visitor list for room 412. The clerk told her she was not. Teresa pulled the visitor log for the previous month and read the entries again. She saw the entry for the unpaid caregiver, temporary, please advise. She remembered the way Richard had eaten 3 cookies at the bedside on the first evening. She remembered the small sentence he had spoken about brown sugar and nutmeg. She told the unit clerk, in a voice she reserved for matters that mattered, that she was going to make a phone call to the attending physician and the head of rehabilitation, and that she was going to do so on her unpaid lunch break, and that the conversation would take approximately 11 minutes. The clerk nodded. Teresa made the call. The head of rehabilitation, a man named Dr. Aidan Porter, listened to her description of the cookie visit, the recognition response, the 10-day pattern of consistent voluntary feeding and the family letter. He walked to room 412 within the hour. He sat at the foot of the bed. He asked Richard whether he remembered the cookies. Richard told him, in the same small voice Dorothy had heard on the first evening, that the cookies tasted the way his mother's kitchen had smelled on a Sunday in October. Dr. Porter walked back to the nurses' station. He called the chief of staff. He told the chief of staff, in a voice that did not soften, that removing Dorothy from the visitor list would jeopardize a measurable clinical milestone, and that he would be documenting his objection in the patient's chart, in writing within the hour. The chief of staff held the phone for a long moment. The chief of staff called the family's lawyer. The lawyer called Preston. Preston did not return the call until the next morning. By the end of the 5th week, Richard had begun to speak again in small fragments. He did not remember his wife, his son, his grandchildren, his estate, his accountant, his pilot, his office, or his name on the lobby wall of the company's headquarters. He remembered the cookies. He remembered the smell of rosemary in the service porch. He remembered a small brick house in Macon where a man in a white apron had told him to wait for the biscuits to cool before he touched them. He remembered on the 3rd Saturday of his stay that his mother had been left-handed. He asked Dorothy on that Saturday morning whether she had ever met his mother. Dorothy told him she had. He asked her, in the small even voice of a man remembering a woman he had loved very carefully, whether his mother had been kind. Dorothy told him plainly that his mother had been the kindest woman she had ever baked for in 31 years of baking for other people's families. He asked Dorothy if she would bake him the cookies every Saturday afternoon until his mother came back. Dorothy told him she would. She did. She baked 16 cookies in the morning. She carried them in the warm tin in her canvas bag. She arrived at 6:58 in the evening, and she sat in the green vinyl chair and opened the lid and let the smell drift across the bed rail and across the pillow and across his quiet mind. The 5th week ended on a Sunday afternoon. Preston walked to room 412 on Sunday night, in a quiet charcoal suit, and stood at the foot of the bed for 11 minutes. Richard looked at him. Richard did not know him. Richard asked him in the same small voice he used for everyone he did not know whether the young man would like a cookie. Preston thanked him and declined. Preston walked back to the elevator. He stood in the elevator bank for a long moment, then he walked back to room 412. He stood in the doorway. He asked Dorothy, in a voice much smaller than the voice he had used in the second-floor conference room, whether she would be willing to accept a paid formal position on his father's care team. Dorothy thanked him and told him she would think about it. The ethical fulcrum came on the morning of the 56th day, in a small private room on the 3rd floor of Brookside, after Richard had been cleared by the head of rehabilitation for outpatient cognitive therapy. Preston had drafted a formal employment contract for Dorothy, in a small navy folder, on cream paper, with the Caldwell family crest embossed in the upper left corner. The contract offered Dorothy a salary of $240,000 per year, plus a full benefits package, plus a private room in a small guest house on the estate grounds, plus a private sedan for her use, plus the keys to the back service entrance returned to her on a small velvet pillow in a private ceremony at the family office. The contract offered her a small annual stipend for as long as she lived. The contract offered her, in a single handwritten clause at the bottom of the third page, a one-time inheritance of $3 million from the Caldwell Family Trust, payable within 30 days of her formal acceptance. Preston handed her the folder on a Wednesday morning, in a small private room at Brookside. Melanie was in the room, on a small chair near the window, in a cream blouse. The family's lawyer was in the room with a small leather binder. Teresa Banks was not in the room but was told about the meeting by the unit clerk and was waiting in the fourth-floor hallway. Dorothy opened the folder. She read the first page, she read the second page, she read the third page. She read the handwritten clause at the bottom of the third page twice in silence. She set the folder down. She folded her hands on her lap. She looked at Preston for a long moment. She told him plainly that she could not accept the inheritance. She told him that her late husband Eugene had taught Sunday school for 42 years and had never taken a gift he had not earned. She told him that the $3 million was a beautiful amount of money, and that the cottage on the grounds was a beautiful room, and that the sedan was a beautiful car. She told him that she had baked 16 shortbread cookies every evening for 56 days because Mr. Richard had been alive, and because alive was the only inheritance she had ever needed from anyone. She told him that the cookies were not a business transaction. She told him that the cottage was not a business transaction. She told him that the inheritance was a beautiful gesture that she would remember for the rest of her life, and that she would regret declining for the rest of her life, and that she was declining it. Preston asked her very gently what she would accept in place of the inheritance. Dorothy told him in a voice that did not shake that she would accept one thing and one thing only. She told him that she had worked as a low-wage housekeeper for 31 years and had watched 170 other low-wage women come and go through the kitchens and the linen rooms and the service corridors of the estate. She told him that the women had worked without health insurance. She told him that the women had worked without paid sick days. She told him that the women had worked without a clear path to a wage that could keep a child fed through a long winter. She told him that the cookies had worked because the smell of a thing a man loved in childhood could unlock the quiet rooms where his memory was still sleeping. She told him that cookies were not medicine, and that the women who had baked them for 31 years without health insurance were not nurses, and that the women who had not been seen by the family for 56 days were the invisible second floor of Richard Caldwell's life. She told him, finally, that the only inheritance she would accept was a foundation bearing Mr. Richard's name and her own, in equal lettering at the top of the letterhead, with the explicit mission of funding paid sick leave and full health benefits for every direct care worker employed by every Caldwell-owned property in the country, for as long as the foundation existed. She asked him, in the same voice she had used to ask for the cookies each evening, whether that was something the family might consider. She did not ask for a yes. She did not ask for a date. She simply asked whether the family might consider it. Preston thanked her for her time. Melanie thanked her for her time. The lawyer thanked her for her time. The meeting ended at 11:43. Teresa was waiting in the fourth-floor hallway with a small coffee in a paper cup and a deck of playing cards for the older patients on the rehabilitation floor. She had heard nothing of the meeting except the small click of the door latch. She asked Dorothy in the small quiet hallway how the meeting had gone. Dorothy told her plainly that she had declined the gift. Teresa asked her why. Dorothy told her in the same voice she used for every question that mattered that the cookies had been enough. Teresa nodded. She did not press further. The elevator door opened. Dorothy stepped inside with her canvas bag and her empty cookie tin. The door closed. She went home. She made herself a sandwich at 1 o'clock. She read a chapter of Proverbs at 1:45. She rose again at 4:30 the next morning and baked 16 shortbread cookies for the next visit. It had been a long evening, and we are approaching the close of this story. So if you have walked with Dorothy from her small brick kitchen in Memphis all the way to this small private room on the third floor of Brookside, take a moment in the comments to leave the word rich for the woman who taught an entire family what the word actually means. Because the next chapter of her life begins not with a gift but with a foundation. And the foundation is the part of the story that will outlive all of us. Preston called his sister the following morning. He called the chairman of the family's foundation board. He called a small private non-profit attorney in Atlanta named Elena Maddox, who had advised the family on community grants for 15 years. He sent the navy folder back to Dorothy on a Wednesday afternoon, in a small brown envelope, with a single handwritten note on cream paper that read, in his father's small even voice, "We accept." Dorothy read the note twice. She set the note on the dresser beside her Bible and went back to bed. She did not weep. She did not call anyone. She rose again at 4:30 and baked 16 shortbread cookies for the Saturday visit, the way she had baked them every morning since day 14, and she went to Brookside at 6:58 in the evening and sat in the green vinyl chair and let the smell of the cookies drift across the bed rail. Richard asked her in his small voice whether her mother had ever taught her how to braid bread. Dorothy told him that her grandmother had taught her how to bra.